Hey guys, we're talking today about Chapter 6, Section 4, continuing on with our discussion of the American Revolution. We are looking at Chapter 6, Section 4, which is titled Fighting for Liberty on Many Fronts. Many fronts. Let's take a look at that word front. That is our only vocab word in this section. Front. A front is a line of battle or zone of conflict between two armies. And we talk about fronts, we're talking about where the fighting is taking place. And if you look at the title of the section, if there's fighting for liberty on many fronts, you can surmise, you can imagine that we're talking about fighting occurring at many different places. And that's exactly what's going to happen. There are many fronts involved in the fighting of the American Revolution, and we're going to look at some of those fronts in this lesson, in this mini lecture. Continuing on with the reading, the American Revolution took place on many fronts. Fighting occurred not only in New England and in the Middle States, but also in the West and in the South. And when we talk about the West, we're not talking about the far West, Washington, California, Oregon. No, those are not yet states at the time of the American Revolution. When we talk about the West, we're really talking about the area west of the Appalachian Mountains and south of the Great Lakes, the Ohio River Valley, and south along the area around the Mississippi River. That is where most of the fighting is going to take place when we talk about the West, and also fighting in the American South. Important battles were fought on the frontier and at sea. So in addition to fighting taking place in the East, fighting is going to take place both on the frontier and at sea. And that will be the topic in a couple of minutes of today's chart, the chart that goes along with this section. Now, in the West, there's going to be many Native American groups that are going to become allies of the British. The British were able to persuade Native Americans that a patriot victory would mean more white settlers moving on to Native American lands. So let's talk about that point for a moment. It's really important to understand. In the American Revolution, the British Army and the mother country, Britain, convinced many Native Americans to let them become their allies, because Britain would tell the Native American tribes that if the Patriots won, if the Continental Army wins, if the United States wins, it will mean bad news for Native American lands. So the British are able to convince some Native American tribes that they need to team up with each other to beat the Americans. All right. Now, although the American Navy was poorly funded, and we said a couple of lessons ago, I think it was in Chapter 6, Section 1, not only was it poorly funded, but when the war began in 1775, there was no American Navy. So just a few years in, we're talking now, although the American Navy was poorly funded, it still managed to do some damage to British fleets. The most famous battle was that was won by an American captain named John Paul Jones, who captured a British ship off the coast of England. We will see a video on that clip in class. Captain John Paul Jones. He was an American naval officer. He was not an American citizen, and he had quite the colorful history, quite the colorful past before he became a naval commander for the United States Army or United States Navy. Women also would play an important role during the American Revolution. Women would play a vital role. When men joined the Army, women took on the added work of tending farms and businesses. While the husbands and sons and brothers were off fighting, women were left behind to handle the family's affairs, including farming and businesses, etc. Women also helped supply the troops, making shoes and weaving cloth for both blankets and uniforms. Some traveled with the Army, as we will learn, caring for the wounded, washing clothes, and cooking. A few women also took part in battle, and we'll look at some of those instances in a lesson in a day or two. African American males fought on both sides during the war. This is important to understand. They fought on both sides. African Americans are going to fight on the side of the British. They are also going to fight on the side of the American Army. The British would promise freedom to any male slave who fought for the king. So that was an enticement. The British would promise freedom to any male slave who agreed to fight for the king. And about 5,000 African Americans fought on the Patriot side, serving as soldiers, sailors, drummers, spies, and guides. And we'll take a look at a couple again in a lesson, in a video lesson that we'll see later this week. Enslaved African Americans faced difficult choices. It was a very difficult situation for enslaved African Americans. They could fight for the colonists who had no plans to grant them their freedom. It's important to understand that. The colonists would let the African American slaves fight, but they were not promising freedom. And they risked being captured and sold by the British, or they could try to escape to the British. Okay? They could try to escape to the British. By doing so, they risk being hanged by angry patriots. So let's just make sure we clarify what we just read. Enslaved African Americans faced difficult choices. They were kind of being pulled in a couple of different directions. They could fight for the colonists who had no plans to free them, granting freedom to them, and risk being captured and sold by the British, or they could try to escape to the British side during the war. By doing so, they risked being hanged by angry patriots. If an escaped slave, okay, if a slave is escaping and they're trying to escape to connect with the British Army, and they are caught by a continental soldier or by maybe even a colonist who's not a soldier, if they're caught trying to escape to fight for the British, that might easily result in that slave being apprehended and hanged for basically siding or attempting to side with the British. Taking a look at our chart in this section, it's titled The War in the West. Let's look at some of the characteristics, some of the things that were happening in the West in the American Revolution. Cherokee and other Southern Native Americans would become British allies and fight against settlers. We mentioned this in the reading. Cherokees and other Native American groups would become British allies and fight against the settlers. Fierce fighting will take place between settlers and Iroquois forces in Pennsylvania and New York. Fierce fighting will take place between settlers and Iroquois located in PA, Pennsylvania, and New York. Also, patriots under George Rogers Clark capture British forts in the Ohio Valley. Okay, George Rogers Clark is able to lead a group of patriots capturing British forts in the Ohio Valley. And also, Spain will provide military help to the patriots on the southwestern frontier. Not only does France aid in the American effort, in the Continental Army effort, after we learned in Chapter 6, Section 3, that after the Battle of Saratoga, France will become our ally. Also, Spain will assist with military help to the patriots on the southwestern frontier. Let's take a look at our questions below the chart. Question 1, again, is going to be based on the reading. How did women take part in the war? And there are numerous things that you can refer to in the reading that women did to take part in the war. Take a moment to answer question 1. Question 2 is going to require you to look at the chart, which is to the right of me. Okay, chart skills. We're looking at question 2. Which allies did each side have in the war in the West? So you're going to use the chart titled The War in the West to answer question 2. Which allies did each have side in the war in the West? Take a moment to answer question 2. And when we return, we will be looking at the last section in Chapter 6, Section 5, which is titled Winning the War in the South. You know, when the war first started in 1775, it started in the New England colonies. It started in and around Boston. It will then shift to the middle states. It will shift to New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. Well, toward the end of the war will be decided not in the northern states, not in the middle states, but it will ultimately be decided in the southern states. And that is the title of Chapter 6, Section 5, which we will see next. That is titled Winning the War in the South. Until then, guys, be safe, and we will see you next time here in Social Studies.